And people were in the streets, it's just almost as dark as night, and people were in the streets at Buffalo, praying in the street and so forth, thinking it's the end of the world. Well, that really sounded big to me. And we started watching to the north, and you could see this cloud just rolling along, and we started buttoning up, closing up the drive-in, and birds and grasshoppers and every kind of insect were flying in front of it, and it was a huge, just rolling cloud of just dust. It was real awesome. And when we saw it was getting close, I lived about 3 blocks from the drive-in. And when I saw it getting fairly close, ran home to close up the house. Now, to keep dust out of the house, we always put wet sheets inside the doors and windows and so forth. We just wet our sheets down. I did all that before the storm got here, and within 5 minutes after the storm got here, the light bulb in the room was just a little yellow spot on the ceiling. The dust just came rolling on in the house too. But it was really an awesome storm. Of course, you've seen pictures of it, I suppose. Got them at the museum.
How long did that storm last?
Oh, I mean, the storm rather short-lived, but the dust was here for days. But the thing that was unusual about it is the way it rolled in. Usually the wind started blowing and it just started kicking up dust. It just kept getting a little dirtier and a little dirtier and a little dirtier. A lot of times we'd have a nice day here, and we'd just see the dirt start sifting in out of the sky, and we'd turn our sky. Remember the red dirt that come in? We had a lot of Colorado and Texas and Kansas dirt. It wasn't ours. We sent ours somewhere else, but we got that imported stuff, and it come in. School, we closed schools. Quite often we closed the school because it was too dirty to sit in the classroom. When we get out of class, now this was about the time I was in high school. Now this is later in the 30s. But I remember in our high school classes, I'd get out, and quite a lot of us would go down to Woodward Theater, not to see what was on the show, but to get inside the theater where they had washed air. They had a big evaporated cooler, and this washed air, and that was the only place we could go where we had good, clean, fresh smelling air.
Now, what is washed air?
Well, that was just evaporated cooler. But that was the way that's what they advertised was washed air, but it was big evaporated cooler that they blew their fans through and distributed in the theater. Just
to keep the dust out?
Well, it cleaned the dust out. You know, so your air, it really was pretty much a waterfall that the air went through, and it kept the dirt pretty well, and you didn't have the real dirty theater.
Was it a water cooler?
Yeah, just big water cooler. They had huge water coolers. But they had really huge ones in the theater, and everything was closed up, and they'd turn those on and wash through there, and it sure did get the air cleaned out.
What about World War II?
I was there too. I first heard about Pearl Harbor. We were moving. We lived on 13th Street. We were moving from one side of the street to the other. We were in the process of moving, and somebody said, well, Gabriel Heather's on the radio this time of day, and he says that they bombed Pearl Harbor. And I said, Pearl Harbor, where's that? He said, well, that's where Honolulu is. And I said, gosh, my aunt lives there. That was my dad's sister. And then we stopped to listen to it, and of course it just sounded like it was war immediately, and sure enough it was. The war was declared the next day, but that day there was no doubt of what we were going to be in the war. And I was married and had a family, and in those days of course people did enlist. I didn't enlist. I was drafted. I was 23 years old, drafted in 1944. I had child was the reason I hadn't been drafted before that. And I went in at Fort Sill, and later on went to Camp Lee, Virginia for basic training, and also I took my technical training there and became an officer there through OCS, and then went to Fort Warren, Wyoming, and then to Honolulu, and then from there to the invasion of Okinawa.
And what was your specialty? What did you do?
I was quartermaster,
Quartermaster.
officer in the quartermaster corps.
Mm-hmm. So you in the invasion of Okinawa?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about it.
Well, it's good. It started on Easter Sunday in 1945, April 1st, I believe, either 1st or 6th. I'm vague right now on the date, but it started then. This was to be the supply point for the invasion of Japan, and called the islands, the group of islands then was called the Ryukyus Island, and then Okinawa was the largest of the Ryukyus Islands, and we went in, came down off of the ship, just crawling down off of the ropes, ladders and so forth, coming off the ship, and waded ashore, and the bombs were bursting in air, and really had a fairly easy entry. They had thought that it would be pretty heavy fighting on getting in. We didn't have a real tough time getting in, but after we got in, it was pretty hard to move very far, very fast. But island was secured, in July, I believe it was, and the fighting had been from the middle of the island to the south. The northern half was almost all rough land and very few people lived there. Incidentally, on our briefing before we went in, we were briefed when we were on the ships going over. Had real elaborate pictures of the island and what the frogmen had done. I thought fantastic amount of information, considering there hadn't been any Americans allowed on the island for years and years. And they had photographs of haystacks that had a machine gun emplacement. They had tombs. The island had thousands of tombs around the hillside, and which ones were activated with artillery and so forth, and which ones weren't. And very, very detailed information. But one thing that we all were very well versed on was it was the heaviest infested island in the world with rattlesnakes. So we all had our rattlesnake gear and all of our rattlesnake kits. But as it turned out, the rattlesnakes were all in the north half of the island, and they pretty well stayed there in the more or less wild. And the Marines went to the north and the Army to the south, except for one division of Marines. And the first division of Marines got hung up at the city of Naha. And for several weeks we were just pinned down. We couldn't get through Naha. That was the biggest city in Okinawa. So finally they put another division of Army in with it, and finally we got the island secured. So that's about what it amounted to.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of things going on.
Were you in any of the battles in the tombs?
No, our biggest problem was artillery. In Okinawa there are a lot of caves. You may have heard of the escarpment, a lot of caves. Well, they had full-size trains operating inside these caves, and also they had artillery that was operating in. And they'd come in, and they'd just come out and shoot their artillery and roll it back in, and you couldn't get to them. What they finally did, they just crawled these escarpments and hills and so forth, and used napalm and just got them out that way. They'd give them a chance to surrender, but if they didn't, well, which they didn't do very readily.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just put napalm in, and that's the way they got them out of the caves.
Now, what were your duties in the invasion?
Well, I was a supply officer, and had a real, I think, unusual experience in that our one company, which was a depot supply company, wound up, they had 29 days of heavy, heavy rain, just as heavy as you've ever seen in your life. The island had only 2 short strips of paving on it. So every vehicle was stalled. They could not move. There was no way that they could move through the mud. And even horses couldn't move. So it just got to be a slogging type deal. You walk through, or that was all you could do, just walk through it. And our company was on the east side of Okinawa, and we were establishing a depot supply dump, which would be used later on for the invasion of Okinawa. And we were getting Army supplies for this, invasion of Japan. We were getting Army supplies for this invasion that coming in and take care of that, plus all the supplies, civilian supplies and everything for Japan. And we had just mountains of rice and so forth. But as it turned out, when all this rain came, we were the only supply group of any type on the island that could get to the ships to unload them. So the 10th Army just told us to take care of all the supply, and we supplied Army, Navy, Marine with everything. And it was with artillery, it was with every type equipment and everything that came into the island. We as a company supplied. We'd commandeered a whole bunch of small ships and boats and so forth, and we'd go out to a ship in the harbor and start unloading it. And you never knew what was going to be on it. You might run into PX supplies in one spot and all types of artillery and ammunition in another spot. Well, you couldn't go off and leave them. You had to just take them layer at a time. And so we wound up taking all this into the beach, this one company doing all this, and then distributing it to the various companies. And so it was a kind of an unusual thing that we were supplying Army, Navy, and Marines for the whole operation, where there normally would be several of them. And we'd take it in like we had set signals as to where, if it was an infantry platoon that needed supplies, well, we'd take a small craft of some kind and go in wherever they signaled, and we'd go in and try to get supplies to them. And we got to where we were not very careful, and we used the same signal quite a few times, and so the Japs started using the same signal. They got us pinned down one time, and we had a pretty good sized ship going into the harbor that time, and wound up that there were only 5 of us got out of that one. They pinned us down with enemy fire, and we had quite a time getting out of it, but we did. And
you lost a lot of men.
yeah, and but from then on we would get a different signal by radio each time, and it worked all right. We didn't get caught anymore.
That taught you a lesson.
Yes. What'd you do on VJ Day?
Well, on VJ Day, I was back in the States. Matter of fact, I might even start a little before VJ Day. I had a fractured skull, and I'd been evacuated to Guam, and then back to Hawaii, and then to Temple, Texas, and I was on temporary leave. And well, first let me just go. When I first got to the United States, I was going up the steps at the hospital at Letterman General Hospital in San Francisco, and saw a newspaper that says, "Yanks atomize Japs." That was my first association with atomic bomb, first I even heard of it. But I thought, well, now what are they going to use next for description of what they do to the enemy? But they atomize the Japs. But then I came on to Temple, Texas, to the hospital there, and they gave temporary leave. And you asked about VJ Day. I was in Rush Springs, Oklahoma, driving through town, and all the fire whistle, and they were having the watermelon celebration, and that town was going wild when we drove into the town, and we had a radio on, and VJ Day, the Japs had just surrendered, so it was a pretty festive occasion right there in the middle of Rush Springs. So we celebrated by eating watermelon.
Yeah. Good. And next question is the tornado.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to know, did you receive some medals then?
No, there were some issued to our company, and I never did receive them. There were some issued to our company, but I never did go to pick them up or anything.
Or you never did go pick them up?
I was in the United States and never did get in contact with them.
What was
They were
it?
given citations, but Vinegar Joe Stillwell gave us a citation for this supply deal that we did for all the different services, and they gave us a citation as a unit for that.
And which battle was it now, this,
Well,
that you were injured in?
well, actually, I wasn't injured in the battle. I received a fractured skull when I was in the States and before I went overseas.
Oh.
And so it wasn't battle oriented or battle connected.
Mm-hmm.
But they had problems with it, and they had blackouts and so forth, and they sent me back.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was the question?
Tornado.
Tornado, yes.
Yeah, well,
Yes, we were.
April 9th.
We'll never forget that
1947,
day.
Well, in those days, we went to the show every change of the theater, and my wife and I were going to the theater that evening, and we were driving around ahead of time, and it was clouds were low scud clouds, and the sun was setting in the west, and there was a real bright orange sky. We just commented about what a peculiar evening it was. We went to the theater, and when the show was, I wish I could remember the name of the show. Do you remember? It sounds something like Hell's Fury. I don't remember. It's something that kind of tied in with it. But we went to the show, and about halfway through, I mentioned that I had this fractured skull. I also had a perforated eardrum that was very, very sensitive to air pressure, and my ears started hurting and popping and so forth. And I told my wife, I said, well, we're going to have a bad storm here or something. The barometer is bound to be going down as much as my ears hurting. So I went out to look at the clouds, and came back in. It was lightning real bad, and I came back in, told Marianne, well, we're going to have a heck of a storm. I don't know whether you want to stay here or go home. And she thought a little bit, and she said, well, I believe this is a little better built than our house is. So we stayed at the theater, and sure enough, it hit there, and of course knocked out all the lights, and fortunately it didn't tear up anything particularly in the theater. There were a lot of people frightened, and people lit matches, and the Terry did a good job of keeping the people quiet. And then when more or less the eye of the storm came, a lot of people got up to leave. And Ben said that he heard that there was another one still coming, and better wait a little bit. So he got people to wait and go sit down again, and with their matches and lights and so forth, the crowd was calm. And then after the storm got over the second blow, after it got past the eye and we had our second blow, we went out. As I walked out of the store, I saw that the top story of our store was gone, and my first thought was to go over and see what happened there. Went over and looked, and the store was all right, just had blown out the windows and blown off the top story, but it wasn't anything that was too bad. So, and by this time, the fire at Osborne Peoples was burning pretty bright, and everything was lit up. You could see it all over town pretty well from reflection on the cloud. And so I said, well, let's go home and see what it's like and find out about our folks. So we went by to see about my mother and dad, and my sister and brother-in-law. They were in their cellar over on 16th Street, and it had pretty well completely wiped out their house. And we went to our house, had very little damage. We lived in the South 10th Street, so we weren't in an area where it hit bad. We had about $2,000 of damage, which was nothing compared to the rest of it. So I loaded the car with all the quilts and blankets and hospital type supplies, or first aid supplies that I could find. Went to the hospital, and the hospital was without light, and that seemed to be the thing that they were needing worse. So went downtown to see if I could get in Boyle's, and it was all locked up. And so I went by Mr. Boyle's house over on 8th Street and asked him if he'd open up so we'd get some, what are these bright burning lights with kerosene,
Lanterns?
what? Yeah, lanterns, but the ones that shine real bright with the mantle in them.
Oh, gasoline.
Gasoline, but what kind of Well, can't think of the kind of, lamp that was.
Cool.
Coleman, yeah, Coleman lamp, the one that made up bright. And, I got him, he was talking to his sister that her house had blown away, and she was real excited, and he couldn't hardly take time to go get the stuff out of the hardware store, but I finally got him down there, and he kept saying, well, who's gonna pay for this? And I said, I will, if nobody else does, I will. But we got, I think it was 12 lanterns from him, and every kind of flashlight and all the batteries we could, and I signed a ticket. He wouldn't let me go until I had a ticket made on it all. But I took all this to the hospital. Also before I went to the hospital, I stopped at what then I believe was F.C. Stark's, and Anderson had a gasoline station on the corner of 8th and Texas, and I got the fuel to light all the lights and took them out to the hospital. And this gave them the light that they could get to see by. And
Where was the hospital located?
it was on 4th Street in about the 1500 block.
Mhm.
And
Was that somebody's home?
no,
Used to be
no,
somebody's.
it was
Who was the doctors at that time?
oh, there was, let's see, Dr. Dewar and Dr. Darwin, Dr. Ted Rowe, Dr. Silverthorne, and Dr. Leachman. I believe that's about the amount of doctors we had then. And I stayed at the hospital for a little bit, but I saw it wasn't anything that I could help much on, and there was a highway patrolman drove up, and I asked him if I could help him. He said, yeah. So I started to go out with him, and he had a flat tire, and I said, well, let's take my car. So we took my car, and we worked from then until the next day, matter of fact, noon the next day, and we'd gone over all kinds of rubbles and rooftops and everything with it, and didn't have a flat tire all the time. And this was real unusual in those days. They didn't have the kind of tires we have now.
That's right.
And we were searching mostly in the northwest part of town where the brunt of the storm was. And we took an awful lot of people, I don't know how many, and it was over 50 people to the hospital. It wasn't just the hospital. The hospitals, by then, they had temporary hospital areas set up. And we found 13 people dead in the process. Of course, didn't do anything for them, but we just marked it so that they could find them.
Mhm.
But it was really a traumatic night.
Yes. Well, we heard that people came in, the looters came in, and there were some girls taken.
There was some looting, but it really wasn't as bad as they really thought it would be. Matter of fact, you notice now most of the time when they have a tornado, they close it to people and don't let them in. Well, they did a little of that, but they didn't have military law. They didn't really close it, and the people were really good. I tell you, I was amazed and still am amazed at how well the people got along and how hard they worked to help each other. And it was a tremendous effort by everybody that was here to get this thing taken care of. Now what you doing? You can do Woodward's birthday.
Oh, as a senior citizen?
No, I just mean Woodward's birthday.
Oh, Woodward's birthday.
Yeah,
Are
you
you
know,
planning a
the-
celebration?
Well, being on Sunday, we're not gonna do it this year. Last year, we had a buffalo feed here,
Oh,
or
you
year
did?
before last it was. I had a buffalo feed here and one at Enid, we had it at the same time.
Well, what year now?
Well,
Be
that's the run,
September
September 16, 1860, said 94, you know, was when the run was.
1894.
That's when the run was. 93. Oh, okay, I get that mixed up. They closed the fort on 94. 93 is right.
93.
Mhm.
Well, wasn't the town here before then?
Yes, sir, but there was a town here. It had been laid out. There wasn't hardly anybody here, but this is really when the people came to Woodward, it'd been laid out as a town by Santa Fe Railroad. And it was a little bit of a center, but not really a town yet.
We visited with a lady out at Senior Citizen.
1887 when it was actually plotted.
Yeah.
And she was, her folks came here when there was just 3 blocks long.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know, I didn't think to ask her what year that she thought when
My folks came here in 1898, and
But you count
they
94.
both, well, 93 was the, 94 they got that mixed up, that's when they closed the fort.
Okay. See, today is September 12th, 1984. This is Joe, Todd, and Bernice Jackson with an interview with Mr. Orlin Trego. Sir, where were you born?
Woodward, Oklahoma,
And when's your birthday?
July 25th, 1921.
Okay. Who's your father?
George Trego.
And where was he from?
Well, he was born in Missouri, moved here when he was 2 years old. They homesteaded east of town, about 2.5 miles,
And what year was that?
roughly 1898.
Okay. And who was your mother?
Lovella Trego,
What was her maiden name?
Wright,
Right.
W-R-I-G-C.
And she was from,
She was from Texas, born in Texas, moved here when she was just barely a baby in 1898, and she was born in 98. They homesteaded out by May, and they lived also in Old Fort Supply in the original, in the fort part.
did she ever talk about Fort Supply?
Oh, she talked about it quite a lot, yeah.
What she, remember any stories about the old fort that she would tell you?
Oh, her memory was how big it seemed to her. She was there until she was about 10 years old. But when she'd go back later, how small it was compared with her memory of it. But she'd tell about driving to town, driving to Woodward in buggy, and how they'd have to open gates along the way, and she and her brother would fight over who'd get to open the gate and so forth. And they'd talk about when the Army was still at the fort, how they'd have retreat. And well, the Army wasn't there, but they would have some periodic programs put on by the state out there as by the federal, and they'd have retreat and so forth. I thought it was really impressive. And she played in the playground there, and she lived in what's now called the Sheridan House. And they lived there for a number of years. Her father, Walter Wright, and his brother were both cattlemen, and they would drive cattle from Mexico up to this area, and they got to use the grassland around the supply fort. It was government land. They were one of the first ones after the fort was abandoned to use it as a feed for cattle.
When was the fort abandoned?
1894.
1894.
Mm-hmm.
And did it remain federal property?
Yes, it remained federal property until 1907. They kept a few men there to keep the place up. There were a few soldiers there. In 1907, it became Oklahoma property and was made into a mental institution at that time. At that time was when my mother moved away from there to come to near that time to come to Woodward.
Yeah. Did she ever talk about Woodward in the early days?
Oh yeah. By the way, getting back just a little bit, Fort Supply, she used to tell about they would cut ice in the wintertime out of the North Canadian River and store it under the porch of the houses, covered with straw, and then in the summertime they'd have a big ice cream feed in July, and they'd have ice cream and cold watermelon, and that's the way they used to have their ice for that. But just think a lot of things along that line.
Yeah.
Now she asked about early Woodward. Oh, I remember telling them about the Tandys. They had a large house on what's now Oklahoma Avenue, and they'd go to her parents would go to the Tandy house for festivities, and the kids would all be sent upstairs to go to bed.
What's a Tandy house?
That's where the rancher Tandy lived. That was their home, and the parents and so forth would stay downstairs and party, and the kids would go upstairs, and said she remembered standing at the top of the stairway watching the people dance and quite a live. So there's a lot of, really a big social event when the Tandys had a party.
How big was the Tandy Ranch?
Oh, I don't know, they had a large ranch around Woodward, but they lived in town.
Is the Tandy House still here?
No, it's where the Long John Silver is now. They tore it down to make a place for Long John Silver restaurant. And it had been restored. It was in good shape, but the old dollar's a little bit bigger sometimes. No, they had made a law office out of it, and so using his law office had really restored it very nicely. It was a nice place.
Well, wasn't the south half of Woodward in this ranch? Wasn't 13th
I
Street?
don't remember anything about the ranch.
Somebody told me that the 13th Street down there was
Mm-hmm. A part of it.
running stream,
Mm-hmm.
and their cattle would water there.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the other ranches in the area besides the Tandy Ranch?
I don't know that the Wrights had ranches, and this was before the Fergusons. I really don't remember the ranches too well that she talked about. She always would mention different ranches, but I don't remember that Tandy's was. And then she played with the Houston kids a lot, and she ran around with one of the Houston girls, and so she talked quite a bit about the Houston family and the Houston house. And,
Did she know Temple Houston?
oh yeah, she knew him well.
What was he like?
Oh, flamboyant, boisterous, nice, kind, gentle. He had all kinds of attributes about it, but he was a fine man.
Were there any ranches in here before the land run?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
How did they come in if it was?
Well, this was Cheyenne Arapaho country,
Yeah.
and the government leased some of the land out for ranches, as I remember reading, that some of the land was leased out in various areas that the Cheyenne Arapaho wasn't using, and that the government thought would be worthwhile getting some lease money out of it.
That was the same way up in the Panhandle.
Mm-hmm.
The government leased land.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there were some English companies came in and leased land.
Down at the Bank of Woodward, they have a good map of the early day layout of the ranches and who had the various ranches, and they may have it here at the museum, I don't know, but it shows a lot of the different ones and the dates that they were there and who the owners were. It's a good map.
Yeah. When was the town of Woodward platted?
Well, it was platted in 1887, as I understand it, by the Santa Fe Railroad. But they had two surveys on it. One of them was done by the U.S. engineers and one by the Santa Fe Railroad. And that's the reason for the crook in the street at 7th Street. That part west of there was the railroad part, and east of there was the U.S. part, I believe it was. But the part that most of the original Woodward, they settled, and some of the first buildings were on the east side of 7th Street. And there was quite a hassle between the two areas, and almost like two towns for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And this Temple, let's see, it wasn't Houston, it was Lawn that had their office just barely over the line in 7th Street. And
Yeah.
There was, and Woodward was settled a whole lot by people out of Colorado. There was a Colorado settlement company that came in here, and a lot of the lots were originally bought up by people, I don't mean on the homesteading, but lots later on that were sold to people from,
This was located.
and I've read it, but I don't remember where it was. It was in the west part of
Is in the
West part
part
of
that
Woodward.
the
It
railroad,
was just, well,
in the part that the Santa Fe had.
I believe it's in the other part.
And-
Interesting part about Woodward, the original layout of Woodward the map, I mean, if you see the plat on Woodward, the original Woodward is made exactly like Alva, and done by the same ones. And what is now the courthouse area is what Alva Square is. Woodward was supposed to have a square, and at 16th and Main was the beginning of our square, and where the courthouse area is was part of it going to be settled. The people didn't settle that way, and they didn't ever make a town out of it that way. But it's exactly the same layout as Alva had, done by the same engineers.
Mm-hmm. Where did they get the name Woodward?
It was I don't remember the name, full name of the person, but it was one of the stockholders, large stockholders on the Santa Fe Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that he's a member of the board, but later I've heard that he wasn't a member, but he's one of the large stockholders. And they named many of their stations and so forth after either board members or stockholders, and this was a large stockholder as I heard it.
Mm-hmm. Now when they platted Woodward, I guess they knew they were going to have the run sometime. It was going to be open for settlement.
Well, apparently so. I really don't know that much.
Why did they choose this site? Why did they choose this?
Well, this was the original Western Trail across the river at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And the railroad came in 1889, I believe it was, and it was at this point. And so where the railroad and the Western Trail pretty much crossed, and there was a little bit of a settlement here as a result of being platted as a town in 1887.
Could people come in without permission from the government and settle here in the town site? Did they
I don't know that much about it. I think they could under certain circumstances, but I don't know just what it took. I have some early day newspaper or magazines that were printed in the 1880s and 1890s that were before the run,
yeah,
that were in regard to Woodward, and there was some things going on that was primarily shipping of cattle and things. It's a cattle shipping point.
Do we have copies of those?
I don't know.
We do have a museum here.
You have copies here in the museum?
Mm-hmm.
But
They're record act, how do you pronounce it, on film. And I'm almost certain that the museum has them, but I know I have them for all of the papers that were printed in Woodward prior to the run, during the run, and up till statehood. And some of them run up until 1910. But, and I've got a reader that I can read these on. But at one time there were 13 newspapers in the county of Woodward. That's hard to imagine. Now, I just have them for the city of Woodward, but I have...
Do you know the names of them all?
Oh, gee, no, I'd have to look them up and tell you, but there were quite 13 newspapers, but towns like, of course, Moreland still has a newspaper, but Moreland and Mutual and I'm trying to think some little towns. Sharon didn't come into being until 1912, so Sharon is one of our latecomers, but Mutual had a newspaper, and I don't know whether Richmond did. I believe Richmond did. And offhand, I don't recall what all the papers were.
Where was Curtis?
Well, it was just east of Moreland. It had a paper. Mm-hmm.
It had a paper.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us about the accident that Santa Fe had? I think it was east of Moreland or in between Moreland and Woodward. Way back.
Yeah, I don't remember the date. I just remember going. It's the one I'm thinking about. I went over as a kid to see it, and there was vegetables strung everywhere, and people were out gathering up vegetables out of the cars that had been ripped open, and but there were train cars just scattered everywhere. But I don't remember the day or the year or anything.
The one I'm thinking about, the cars went off into a river.
I don't remember the, yeah.
That might have been.
I don't remember the river part, but I just remember that, well, there was a bridge in the area, so there must have been a river. I just remember, I had to be 4 or 5 years old, but I just can't recall.
Yes. Well, I remember the incident so well because my aunt was on that train. And the they had somebody down there with the flag to keep the turtles and things away from the bodies.
Hmm.
And she was on that train, but she was in a car back far enough that it didn't go off the track.
Mhm. Well, wasn't it a collision of a freight train and a passenger train? You remember that?
I don't remember that.
That's where I think it was, that's where we had so much of the vegetables and everything was the freight train. I know there was passengers, so I think the one I'm thinking about anyhow had passengers and freight both.
Mhm. Well, I was quite small, and I remember her telling it.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite an experience for her.
Were either of your great-grandfathers in the Civil War, or great-grandfathers?
Great grandfather. I don't recall anything about greats. I know one of the counties in Kansas is named after Trego. Trego County. It's a great uncle, but he was one of the heroes of the Civil War. So I don't know much more than what I've read about it. But I don't know very much about my family really beyond my grandparents. We've got the family Bible and all this, but I don't know much about what they did.
Okay. Where'd you start school?
Woodward, 1927.
1927.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the name of the school?
Well, then they were all divided by wards. I went to school in the East Ward, first and second grade. At that time there was East Ward, North Ward, West Ward, and Little Central. That was for grade schools. And that took care of first and second grade. And then third grade through junior high I went to what had originally been the high school. It was built, I think, in 1918, but this building, at the time that I went to it, it was the third grade through the seventh grade. And then we had a high school building next to that.
Was your father still living on this farm at that time?
My dad came to town in Woodward in 1913. He was living on the farm then. He was cleanup boy in the store that he later on bought. In 1929 he bought interest in the store and later on bought it all. But he lived on the farm, I guess, till he was 18 years old. So 1896 to, just had to figure it on my fingers. But it had been about 1914, I guess, he came to town, moved town.
Yeah.
And the family moved here.
Well,
Is that when
his
he-
parents lived out east of town, 2.5 miles, where they homesteaded. By the way, that farm is still there, the home is still there, and the home was a sod house, soddy. And the house is there and it's been plastered over. You wouldn't know it was a sod house, it just looked like a plastered house, but
But it's still there?
the house is still there. It's
And you
deserted, but it's there.
And that's your,
That would be my grandparents' home,
what was their name?
Trego.
What was his first name?
Albert.
Is that farm
No,
still in the family?
Abner Trego. Albert Van Meter Trego, yeah. What was it?
Is that farm still in the,
Not in the family, no. Grace Minton owns the farm.
well,
As a little boy, what kind of chores do you do around the house?
When I grew up, well, that's my first recollection of anything in the way of work, and I don't suppose I did it regularly, but at 4 years old I cut my finger on a lawnmower and I was pushing lawnmower, but we helped with the dishes by the time I was under 6 when we were doing dishes. We made our own beds. Of course, we didn't have washing machines as such. We had coal oil stoves, and but we all did our own, kept our own rooms up. I say all, my sister and I, and each had a separate room. And we were just expected to do the keeping up of ourselves. We didn't have real heavy chores around the house or anything. I know when I was 8 years old, I was making 50 cents for mowing lawns around the neighborhood, which was a form of spending money, and also selling newspapers. But as far as chores, we just had the things around the house to take care of. Don't know what else.
You didn't have any farm animals?
Oh, no, this was in town.
In town.
See, I lived in town. I was born at, on the corner of 3rd and Main and, or 4th and Main, and I lived within a block of that until I was 18 years old.
And, of course, the stock market crashed in '29.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of games did you play, or what kind of toys did you have
Oh.
in the Depression?
There was marbles that we played a lot. We had vacant lots that we played on. We had one vacant lot that was just pretty much the neighborhood playground, but it wasn't designated as such, but it had quite a few cottonwood trees. We had the big tires and sacks hanging on them that we would use as swings. We had one area of the lot that we used for baseball, one area of the lot that we dug tunnels under and put boards and so forth and covered back over with dirt and sand and so forth, where nobody knew it was there even. And even at the time that they were clearing the lot years later, there were tractors went over this and still didn't break through the old cave that we dug. We had football on this one lot. We had football and basketball and track. All these were organized games of just the kids in the neighborhood. And of course there was nothing in the way of equipment except we had a football or we had a basketball. And it wasn't anything pretentious at all, but we played it according to the rules that we could play it near. It worked fine. Most of them grew up playing on the school football team and so forth.
Yeah, my mother said that they had to make up their own games and make their own toys.
Mm-hmm. Well, we did a lot of that. We'd make scooters, and one thing that I hadn't seen for a long time that was take a round disc or rim and push it with a stick. Don't even know what to call it, but that was a great entertainment, was pushing a little rim and see how fast you could run with it, have races with them and so forth. But it wasn't a whole lot different now, except it wasn't organized for us by adults. It was of our own making.
Okay, and how far did you go through school?
I went to high school here and then college, 3940 as OU at Norman.
What did you major in?
Oh, I was the first man to ever major in home economics. I was studying textiles for the line of business that I'm in. I was the first man to ever have a home economics major.
Well, that's quite an honor. We want you to tell us about this business pretty soon.
After college, you come back to Woodward?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I got married when in college. In those days, you didn't get married and stay in college. You came home and went to work. So I started working at the store, retail store.
Okay, what was the name of the store?
Trego's.
Trego's.
And this would have been in 1940 that I came back to work there. And let's see, I was making $80 a month.
Same as I was teaching school.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back. When did your father start this business?
Okay.
And I presume he did start the...
Okay, I'll kind of just give you a little background of the business. My dad started in 1913 as cleanup boy. He was 16 years old at Trego, what at that time it was Littrell and Harrison store, clothing store. Dad was a 16-year-old country boy cleaning the spittoons and polishing the glass and dusting and all the things that you do on cleanup. And he learned the business and he saved his money, and in 1928 he bought 1/4 interest in it. The store became, no, that was 1929, pardon me. The store became known as the Palace, and it was owned 1/4 by Luther Shobe, 1/4 by Roy Adams, 1/4 by George Trego, and 1/4 by Dick Woodmansey. Then in 1932, Adams and Shobe sold out to Trego and Woodmansey, so the store became known as Trego and Woodmansey. And then the day of bank moratorium in 1933, business was so bad that they didn't think there was enough that they could make a living out of it for two people, and Dick said he wanted to get into something else, so Dad bought him out the day of bank moratorium in 1933. And of course we had what we call depression and recession, but all of the 30s was a pretty hard, rough road to push. But he bought the store, paid it off, and it went very well. And in 1935, we started making, Woodward had a rodeo as of that time, started in 29, but we were having booster trips in the area, and Dad was in charge of the booster trip. And a lot of the women said they would go on the booster trip if they had something Western to wear. Well, in those days, this was hot summertime, just in August, and those days the only thing they had to wear was either all leather outfits, which were hot, or an imitation leather, which is called suede, and they were hot, and give them the least bit hot they got smelly. So he knew he had to supply them with something that would satisfy them for being more comfortable than what was made then. But he put down their name and said, I'll get something for you. We'll take care of that. And when it got close to the time, there wasn't anybody around that he could find making anything besides those two types of things. So he called Denver, which was the center of Western clothing at that time, and called all those places you could think of there, and nobody had anything. But he just knew if he went to Denver, he could find what he wanted. So he and Mother went to Denver. We got up there, and they were at Miller Company, and one of the fellows there said, well, George, go out and see Mr. Fishback. Now, he'll make anything you want. Just design what you want, and he'll make it for you. So that sounded good, and they went out and talked to him, and the results there was fine, except it took a dozen of a size of a color. Well, this wouldn't very well take care. You wanted to take care of a few women in Woodward. Well, a dozen of a size of a color wouldn't work very well for what you wanted. But the idea of making it did kind of appeal to them. So when they came home, they went into the store next door and bought some corduroy, bright red corduroy, and some oilcloth, and they made skirts out of corduroy and trimmed the bottom with fringed oilcloth, so it looked kind of like leather trim on the red corduroy, and very colorful and much cooler than what they were making then. And then they made a vest that went with it. And he took measurements and sold 56 of these, and these were all sold and made out of our store here. And then the next year they started asking the Chamber of Commerce and the Elks Club, people that we'd gone through on the booster trip, where did the women get their costumes? So they'd refer the letter to us. Well, then they'd say, well, will you make them for us? So that's how we got into the making of Western wear. And then about that time too, Mother and Dad decided to go to California on a trip, and they just made up a little girl's corduroy skirt and trimmed it with leatherette. They updated it and made leatherette instead of oilcloth, and made a vest, and then they made a little satin shirt. They went to California, and they stopped at the best store in every town between Woodward and California, and they sold quite a lot of skirts and boleros for little girls and women's too. So the upshot of it was that was the beginning of our factory, and our factory now employs something over 100 people, and we ship worldwide, and it's still making Western wear, known as Trego's Westwear.
That's quite a story. It's an interesting story.
My father passed away in 1948, and his son-in-law, Garnet Fry, was active in the factory at that time, and he took over. He was manager at that time, and he kept on managing and took over the complete production and everything. And he still is the president of the company, and my sister's active in it, and I'm more or less active in the retail businesses.
Okay, so you're in the retail.
Now I'm vice president of the Trego's Westwear, but I'm more active in the retail end, where I'm president of that group.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my sister and my son, myself.
Yes, and you just had, there were just the two children, you and your sister.
Thurleen Fry.
How many children do you have?
I have two sons, Terry
Are
and
they
Denny.
both in the retail business?
Well, they both have been, but just recently, my oldest son, Denny, started in the banking business, so he's senior vice president of the Paris Savings and Loan in Paris, Texas. So he's gotten out of the rag business and into banking.
Yes.
Were you around here for the dust storms
Oh,
in Woodward?
yeah.
Tell me about it.
Well, they were long, dirty, long-lasting. The most prominent one in my memory, I, of course, remember lots of them, but the most prominent one was the one on, I think it's April 14th, 1935, when the one just came rolling in. And I was working at Three Little Pigs Restaurant, drive-in, and the woman that owned it, Martha Bell Barnes, was a friend of girls that worked in the telephone agency and the operator, and they called her and told her that we had a bad storm on the way, and said people were really worried about it north because it was rolling in from the north, and said it was really something unusual.
This is Joe Todd, and this is an interview with Mr. Orlin Trego.
Right.
Okay. Sir, would you tell us about Black Sunday? The
Black
dust storm.
Sunday, as I recall, that was April 14th, 1935. I was a young lad working at a drive-in, the Three Little Pigs, and the woman that ran the place, her name was Martha Bell Barnes, had some friends that were telephone operators, and they had called from Buffalo saying that there was a bad storm coming, told her about it. And in turn, a little later, they called and said that it was almost as dark as night in Buffalo, and people were in the streets praying, and some of them thought it was the end of the world. It really was quite a storm on its way. So we were watching to the northwest, watching for this to come, and pretty soon we did see it rolling in. And it really did roll, and it got big, and there were birds and grasshoppers and bees and every kind of bug you can imagine flying in front of it. And it's a huge, big rolling cloud. When it got close enough, it felt like we needed to get home in time to button up the house. In those days, we put sheets, wet sheets, over all the doors and windows on the inside so that the dust wouldn't get through too bad. So I ran home. It was only 3 blocks from there, and hadn't quite gotten there yet. And I closed all the doors and windows and got the sheets wet. But within 5 minutes after the storm hit, the light bulbs inside the house were just little yellow balls up there. They just, the dust just came on through in spite of the wet sheets, and we also had special weather stripping on the house. But it was a big, big rolling cloud of dust and birds and weeds and whatever you wanted to see. And we saw lots of dust storms over the years, but this was the most spectacular of them all.
How'd you breathe the dust storm?
You just breathe, coughed a little. You just had a lot of dust. It's kind of like we still have some days that are kind of similar to a dust storm. We don't have some quite as thick.
What's dust pneumonia?
Well, dust pneumonia is when you get too much dust in the lungs, and it usually came when people were in a weakened condition anyhow from a cold or something, and then they would go ahead and have pneumonia, and the dust was a part of what caused them, aggravated.
Do you have any questions about dust storm?
We lost a lot of people in the dust storms with dust pneumonia.
Oh, yeah.
And further north and west, the dust was worse than it was here at Woodward too.
Yeah, most of our dust here was caused by the other states' dust rather than our own. I'm sure we transported some of ours, but we got Texas and Colorado and Kansas dust here. That's why it would come in. Many times it would cover, not just our part of the country, but it would cover lots of countries. They would have dust sometimes far back from New York and even out in the Atlantic Ocean. Still, they'd see the dust in the air from these storms. So they were violent storms.
Were you ever in downtown Woodward when the dust storms hit?
Oh yeah, that was, matter of fact, this little drive-in was downtown Woodward. It's at 5th and Main,
Yeah.
and then we had a store at 817 Main, and many times seen the storms come in there. But most of the time our storms would start kind of like they do now, with the wind turning and just start kicking up a little bit of dust, and it just kept getting dustier and dirtier and dirtier and redder, and finally it just gets real thick. But once in a while we'd get one that we wouldn't have much of cloud or anything else, or even wind hardly, where we'd just get a big cloud of dust that would just settle in on us from, like I say, the other states, and a lot of red dirt, or we could almost tell which state it was coming from by the color of it. The Colorado was usually kind of a gray dirt, and the red dirt was usually from Texas.
Well, they think this bad storm started in North Dakota, where the dirt, black soil.
Well, it was black.
It was black.
It really was.
Miss Jackson, why don't you tell us your dust story, your dust storm story, about when you and the
Are you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, that Sunday morning, it was such a beautiful Sunday, such a beautiful day, and I had my windows all changed, and my husband helped me, and we cleaned house from top to bottom. It was shining so pretty, and we ate our lunch for the first time without any dust in the air, and so we decided we'd go for a walk. But for some reason, we sat down on the back steps and just enjoying the warm, sunny day. And we saw rabbits and bugs and thistles flying by the corner of the house. And so we ran to see what was coming in this storm that by that time was quite up in the air, it was quite hot, not too far from us. And my husband told me to take our little boy and go to the house, and he ran to the windmill to shut it off. And before I could get in the house, it was so black that I couldn't see my little boy. And he was just right close. I had hold of his hand, but yet I couldn't see him. I knew where a chair would have been placed in the kitchen, and I headed in that direction. I found the chair, sat down, and put him on my lap, and still I couldn't see him. And every little bit he'd reach up and touch my face. He wanted to know that I was there too, you know. And I began to get worried about Bryce. He hadn't come in from shutting the windmill off. And I thought, well, should I go see if I could find him? Then I decided I'd be better off just sitting there, that he would be all right. And he spoke, and he said, "Where are you?" And I reached out and touched him. We couldn't see each other. It was that black. It was the blackest black I ever witnessed.
where were you living then?
We were living on our farm in Beaver County, southeast Beaver County. And after a while, he got choking, and he got to where he couldn't breathe, and so he found the matches, and he lit a match, and he started the kerosene stove, and he managed to find his way and get a pan of water and set on this burner, and he put his face right down over that steam, and that way he could breathe. it didn't seem to bother John and I in the breathing. But about a week after that, he got sick, and I'm sure that he had just pneumonia. Anyway, we went to Beaver, and I had saved buffalo nickels the last 4 years to buy me a new linoleum that was wearing out quickly. And we didn't have any money, but I did have $6 in buffalo nickels. I wish I had them today. But anyway, I took those along with me to help out on our expenses at the hospital, and it turned out he did have pneumonia, but the doctor didn't keep him. He gave him medicine and sent him home. And I asked him what the charge was, and he said $6. I laid down my $6 worth of buffalo nickels. The doctor didn't want to take them. I'd been about 4 years saving them. But I said, no, I don't know where the money's coming from to pay you, and I've got it here, so you take them. And so he took the $6 worth of buffalo nickels. And that's the way we put in our Sunday.
Yeah.
It didn't stop. It blew the rest of the night, but it cleared up to where we could see the barns and the granaries. And the next day, the horses and the cattle came in, and their faces were just caked with mud, black mud, where they had breathed, and their water from their eyes and their nose and caked with the mud. They were a pitiful sight.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Trego, tell us right quick about the tornado of 1947 here in Woodward, what you did.
Okay, well, the evening, we always went to the show every time the picture changed, and we were doing the show that evening, and we drove around just a little bit. We were a little bit early, and we drove around a little bit, my wife and I, before we went to the show. Matter of fact, my wife, son, and we were noticing low scud clouds and the red sunset in the west, or orange sunset, and we were talking about, looked like there could be a storm come up yet this evening. And we went to the theater, Woodward Theater, and about the middle way of the show, my ear got to bother me. I had a sensitive ear caused by a bore injury that I could tell if the barometer was falling, so I was going out, I looked out to see what the clouds were doing. And sure enough, it looked like we were going to have a real bad storm. A lot of flickering lightning, the bend looked like it was going to be a good storm. So I told my wife, went back and asked her if she wanted to go home or stay there, and she said, well, I believe this is a better built building than our house is, so we stayed there. And in a little bit, the storm did hit, and the theater, of course, the lights went out, and the people were a little bit panicked, but the Terry brothers and the people in the theater lit matches and talked to people, kept them kind of calm, and then they started to leave after the first brunt of the storm, and Mr. Terry said, no, there's another storm on the way, which was really, we were in the eye of the storm then. And then in a little bit it hit again, so people got settled down, and still more matches and lights, and then he did let us go out. And my first thought was, what about the store across the street? And the roof was gone, the front windows were out, and then I got to looking around. The Osborne people had a big fire that was lighting the sky, and in turn that lit the most of the area where you could see, and there were lots of buildings missing, and so we thought we better do some things to help out. So we went to see what was wrong at our house. The house was okay, and we checked on our relatives and friends, and so primarily my parents and my sister, and then we loaded up the car with blankets and quilts and medical supplies, and went to the hospital and gathered up all we could for the hospital. Got the hospital, the lights were out, they needed more lights, so I got Mr. Boyle to go down to Boyle Hardware, and we got all the Coleman miners ahead. I think there was 12 of them, and a lot of flashlights, and we got fuel for the lights at the filling station. They happened to have a filling station pump that was pumping some gas there for cars, so we filled up there in Tempton, Texas, and then went out to the hospital, and that gave them light for the hospital. And then about this time, highway patrolman came up, and I asked him if I could help, and he said, yeah, come with me. So I started to go with him, and he had flat tires on his car, and I said, well, let's use mine. So we used it all that night and most of the next day without getting a flat. And we worked the northwest part of town, and we carried many people to the various temporary hospitals and the hospital. Found 13 dead people, and we didn't do anything about them except mark them so people could find them. But it was really quite a night to remember.
How many people were killed in that tornado?
113, I believe, altogether in the full length storm. I think it was right at 103 in Woodward.
And you say the storm had an eye in it?
Yes.
How big was the thundercloud?
I have no idea. I wasn't out to see it, but the storm stayed on the ground from White Deer, Texas to Whitehorse, Oklahoma. And it's still the longest recorded of any tornado staying on the ground. And what size of the eye, it was probably 2 minutes between when the storm felt like it was over and time started again. So this apparently was the eye of the storm.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.